Hello, dear viewer. Welcome to Primary 5 Social Studies lesson. In this lesson, we are going to discuss a subheading. That is, our heading today is location of Uganda, and we are going to locate Uganda using lines of latitude and longitude. To remind you, we introduced this topic in the previous lessons, and we discussed more and much about Uganda. We said Uganda is located on the on the East African side or continent of Africa, and today we are basically looking at how do we locate Uganda using the lines of latitude and longitude. Our lesson we got from page 18. For us who are having workbooks, you go to page 18 of your workbook. That is where we are beginning our lesson from. We shall be moving up to pages 22. That is where our discussion is got from. So we get on. We are looking at the heading, location of Uganda using lines of latitude and longitude. Before we proceed, we need to first understand what is in this heading, such that we shall later on understand how can we now locate Uganda using latitudes and longitudes. So we are going to have our terms defined, definitions. We are going to have terms defined, and the first term we are having on our board, we are going to look at what we call lines of latitude. I say lines of latitude. These lines of latitude, we simply call them also latitudes. So we can say lines of latitude. I have said we can also call them latitudes. So we need to first understand that. So what are lines of latitude, or what are latitudes? Now latitudes or lines of latitude are the imaginary lines, drawn on a map, imaginary lines drawn on a map from east to west. That is the first item we have to discuss concerning this heading. Lines of latitude, or we have called them latitudes, remember there is S, are the imaginary lines drawn on a map from east to west. Which means, if we are having our globe drawn, or our world map drawn like this, we shall be able to understand that we are having lines that move or that are drawn on this globe, on this map, from east to west. We can say from east to west or west to east. No problem. So, we are going to have our major line of latitude. That is the one we call equator. We call it equator. It is marked 0 degrees. So I believe you are following, and we have understood that if we have the globe, or if we have our world like this represented, we have understood that there is that major line that separates it into two equal halves, as we can see on the board. This is a half. This is another half. Of course, when you were in primary 1, you learned that a half plus a half equals a whole, which means this half plus this half, it will give us the whole, that is 1. So we are having 1. So this line divides this whole globe or this whole world into two equal halves. Each half is given the name. Which name? Yes. This is given the name hemisphere. Hemisphere. That is the name given to each half. So here we have this half that we have called the hemisphere. We shall have another half down, also another hemisphere. Hemisphere. Take serious note of the spelling. So this is forming two hemispheres and they are equal. Now, we need now to understand that since the equator is passing here, it is dividing this into two equal halves. Therefore, we have this hemisphere like this, and also we have the other hemisphere like that. So we are going to name or rename these hemispheres. Generally, we call them hemispheres. But now, which hemisphere is this and which one is this? Now, the one which is this way, we now go to the compass directions. This is north of the equator. This is north of the equator, which means if we were to have our compass here, we shall find that this side is in the north of the equator. So for that case, we shall rebaptize this and we shall give it the name, the northern hemisphere. Very good. This is the northern what? Hemisphere. And then also the one down. Since it is in the south of the equator, we shall give it a name, the southern hemisphere. So this is what we need to understand when we are looking at the lines of latitude. So we are having the equator that we are saying it is the major line of latitude which crosses this globe into two equal halves, and each half is given the name hemisphere, and we have understood the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. I love this because I'm sure we have all understood this. Now, apart from the equator, remember we can ask you a question. Why is the equator marked 0 degrees? Why is this line marked 0? So, this line is marked 0 because it is the starting line from which other lines are measured. Or you can simply say it is the beginning, or it is the starting line for measuring other lines of latitude. Which means that we can have another line now up here going. We can have others numbered, maybe 1 degree, 2 degrees. Up the time we shall reach the 90th degree north. Then we shall have the same. We shall have line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Up to the time we shall be reaching the last, also 9 degrees south. Remember this now south. All the ones which are going up this way are numbered degrees where? North. Whereas the ones down are numbered in degrees south, meaning they fall on the southern part of that equator. So that is why we number this degrees south and the other ones degrees north. So the equator is marked 0 degrees because it is the starting line for measuring other lines of latitude. That is how simple we can understand that. Now, apart from the equator, we also need to note that we also have the other two major lines of latitude. We have the other two major lines. Like I said, all other lines are numbered, still in degrees, up the 90th line. Which means, if we were to estimate, we shall find that up this way, we have another line, a major line, and also, we shall also have another one down here. Of course, they are of the same latitude, I mean, they are of the same distance. So, if for example, let us remove these other ones, because they are minor, and we take the major one that we are having. So, we shall be able to find that we have another important line of latitude up here. These ones are marked 23.5 degrees. Which means, because we are saying that if this one is 1 degree north, 2 degrees north, continuing, we are also having the same measurements south. 1 degree south, 0 degree, I mean 2 degrees south, up the time we reach the 90th. So here we are having 23 degrees. 23.5 degrees. Also here we shall have 23.5 degrees. Now, the difference here is, this is in which hemisphere? These ones here are in the northern hemisphere. So for that case, we shall put our capital N here to mean 23.5 degrees north. North of what? Of the equator. Then we come also to this 23.5 degrees. Where? This one is in the south of the equator. For that case, we put our capital S to mean 23.5 degrees south. The other thing now is we need also to give these lines their names, because they have also their names. Just like you have your name. You can be Paul, you can be Elijah, you can be Edward, Frederick, Junior. I don't know if that one is the name. So you also have your name. So we are also going to give these ones their separate names. This one is the equator. We can't again call this one also equator. No, the name of your friend is not yours. So these ones are the ones we call lines of tropic. Lines of tropic. So for that case, we can call this Tropic of Cancer. That is the name that we give to this. Tropic of Cancer. I want you to take serious note of the spelling. Tropic of Cancer. Tropic of Cancer. Then this one down is also called Tropic. But now this one will be Tropic of Capricorn. Tropic of Capricorn. I want us to be very serious with the spelling. So for that case, we are having, of course, the one in the middle. We say this is the equator. T-O-R. That is equator. T-O-R. Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator. Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees where? South of the what? Of the equator. So these are the other two important lines that we need to understand when we are looking at the lines of latitude, or the lines of, sometimes we call these ones parallels. We call them parallels. I want you to remember that, because we say that these lines are drawn on a map from east to west. And when we look at how they are moving, how they are drawn, we shall find that they are parallel to each other. They do not meet. So for that case, we can also give them another name, parallels. So that is another name we give to these lines of latitudes. Parallels. So we continue. Uganda is crossed by the equator. That is what we need to understand. Uganda is that country which is crossed by the equator. And that's why we find that countries which are crossed by the equator, or areas which are crossed by the equator, always receive direct sunlight. And that's why we find that Uganda has that abundant sunshine, which is experienced in the country. And to show that, we have that yellow color also represented on the Uganda national flag. We shall come to that one when time comes in. So, we also have, apart from Uganda, we have another country in East Africa, a neighboring country to East Africa, which is also crossed. For example, if we are to have our map of Uganda here, we shall find that this map, this country has got its neighbors. Of course, in the previous lesson, we were understanding which countries border Uganda. And we say Uganda borders 5 countries. I believe you still remember them. We had South Sudan, we had Kenya, we had Tanzania, we had Rwanda, and then we had Democratic Republic of Congo, the 5 countries. Now, today we are looking at the equator passing where? Passing via Uganda. So when we look at our map, you will find that we have these lakes drawn like this. We have these lakes drawn like this, for example. So I am having a sketch map here. So I'm showing this as the lakes. And if we are asked to draw our line of the equator, Sometimes you need to be very careful because this is a serious question. They will draw a map of Uganda and someone asks you, use your ruler and a pencil, draw the line marked 0 degrees, meaning draw the equator. What you need to consider is, in Uganda, that is our country, the equator passes through these two lakes. Number one is this lake here. This is the lake we call Lake George. This is Lake George. So we are having Lake George crossed by the equator, and we have here Lake Victoria. Of course, this one everyone knows it. That is Lake Victoria. So we are going to show where the line of the equator passes through. In where? In Uganda. So I have said, consider the two lakes, Lake George and Lake Victoria. So you place your ruler like this and make sure you are going to pass through the two lakes. So you get your pencil, like I have mine here, and then you now position your ruler well and you draw your map of, your line of the equator. So for that, we have seen ours. Let me remove this so that it does not make you to fail to see well what we are having there. So we are having the equator here, 0 degrees. And this is the line that we can write as the equator. So that is where it passes. So it has crossed two lakes, Lake George and Lake Victoria. Those are the lakes that guide us to understand or to locate where this line is to pass. Now, having understood that, we are also understanding which countries are these, which neighboring countries of Uganda are these ones that are also crossed by the equator. So we shall need to understand that Uganda, from this side, in the west, borders Democratic Republic of Congo. So as we can see, the equator crosses also or passes via Democratic Republic of Congo. So we have Democratic Republic of Congo as a neighboring country to Uganda, which is also crossed by the equator. And then on the other side of the east, we are having this country here. This country, of course, this is in Kenya. So for that case, we shall also add Kenya here. And for that, we shall have gotten the neighboring countries to Uganda, which are also crossed by the equator. Now, if we are to look at other neighboring countries of Uganda, let's see whether they are also crossed by the equator. Which other country neighbors Uganda? We are saying in the north, Uganda neighbors South Sudan. Is South Sudan crossed by the equator? The answer is automatically no. South Sudan is far. The equator is here. Are we together? Then we continue. We have Tanzania. Tanzania is here. Is Tanzania also crossed by the equator? The answer is automatically no. It is not. Rwanda is here, bordering Uganda. It's fine, but is it crossed by the equator? No. Which means we are moving to understand something else, which is very important. Now, we have countries that lie both in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere. And then countries that lie completely in one hemisphere. Like a country can be completely in the northern hemisphere or can be completely in the southern hemisphere. But when we look at countries like Uganda, we shall find that some parts of Uganda, for example now, from here, this side is in the northern hemisphere. It's in the north of the equator. Then the other side here, this remaining part, is in the south of the equator. Now, if someone asks you a question, which part of Uganda or which hemisphere is, or in which hemisphere is most of Uganda's land found? or in which area, in which hemisphere we find most of Uganda. So according to our diagram on the board, we shall be able to realize that the largest portion of Uganda lies in the northern hemisphere. Though we do not forget, we should not forget that also we have the southern part, some portion of Uganda lying in the southern hemisphere. Now, when you look at countries like South Sudan, that one is completely in the northern hemisphere. Countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, completely in the southern hemisphere. Those ones are not shared, or they are completely found on one side. So that is what we need to understand about that. So let us discuss which districts lie, or which districts in Uganda are crossed by the equator. Before we go and talk about longitudes now, districts in Uganda crossed by the equator. Sometimes we can say by the latitude marked 0 degrees, which still we understand that latitude marked 0 degrees is the equator. So we are going to look at these districts which are crossed. So I believe all of us have our atlas books. We have our atlas books. When you open your atlas book, you will locate these countries. You look at the map of Uganda, then you look at where the equator passes. In those districts where the equator passes, we shall have districts like Bukomansimbi, we have a district like Bukomansimbi, and then we have a district that is Wakiso. Wakiso is crossed. Wakiso. Do not forget we have Kasese district. Kasese district is also crossed by the equator. Then we have Sembabule. Sembabule. We have Sembabule district also crossed by the equator. We have Chirukura. Chirukura district. Then we have Kalungu. We have Ibanda. We have Ibanda district. So these are the districts which are crossed by the equator. We have districts like Bukomansimbi. We have got Wakiso. We have got Kasese. We have Sembabule, Chirukura, Kalungu, and then we are having finally Ibanda. Those are the districts that we are having in Uganda, crossed by the equator. Can add a page here. So those are the districts that are in Uganda that are crossed by the equator. Now, let us look at what we call the importance of these lines that we call lines of latitude. How are these lines of latitude important? Importance of, I told you, lines of latitudes can also be simply called latitudes. Instead of saying lines of latitude, we can say latitudes, but with S, remember. So, we are continuing with our discussion. So, how are these lines of latitude important? These lines of latitude can help us to determine how far the place is, either north or south of the equator, and that is for the one of the equator itself. But for general, because we are not deriving all these lines, our first answer is these lines help, we use them, they help to locate places, or they are used to locate places. Remember, we have said we are locating Uganda using latitudes and longitudes, and that is the method that we call grid reference. Grid reference. I forgot to tell you that at the beginning of our lesson. Grid reference. So I'm just making you to understand this, that what we call grid reference, we are looking at the way of, or the method of locating places on a map using latitudes and longitudes. That is what we call grid reference. So I have rubbed it. Then the other second reason, or second importance of these lines of latitude, apart from helping to locate places, these lines determine the climate of an area. They help to determine the climate of an area. They are used to determine the climate of an area. When we are looking at the location of latitudes, I mean, when we are determining the climate, we determine the climate according to the latitude. And when we talk about latitude, that is something else that we need to understand. When we talk about latitude, we need to understand that there is a very big difference between latitude and latitudes. I say latitudes, these are the imaginary lines, which can also be called lines of latitude. But if we are having only latitude, if a question is asking you as a P5 child, what is latitude? This is not now about the imaginary lines. No, latitude is the distance of a place from the equator. Remember, this is 0 degrees that we have named equator. So what we mean by latitude, we are meaning the distance of a place from the equator, either north or south. That is what we call latitude. Distance of a place from the equator, either north or south. That is what we mean by latitude. It is completely different from latitudes. When you say S added, that one now is asking you to define the other imaginary lines that are drawn from east to west. But when you see only latitude, then you know that that one is about the distance of a place from the equator, either east, either north or south. Remember, this equator divides this into 2 equal halves. That is what we need to understand about that. Secondly, we have what we call equinox. We have what we call equinox. We also need to understand, in relation to this, we have what we call equinox. Now, what do we mean by equinox? What is equinox? For example, we are being asked a question, what is equinox? Now, to our level, we are simply going to say that equinox is that time in the year when the sun is overhead the equator. Equinox is the time, or we can say is the period. Remember, time is period in a year when the sun is overhead the equator. That is how we define equinox. The period in a year, or we say it is the time in the year when the sun is overhead the equator. This causes equal length in days and nights. That is what we can understand here in our primary 5 class. However, when you continue, when you reach upper classes, like when you reach primary 7, we shall now understand more about this. But for now, this is what you need to understand as the definition of equinox. Let us also go and talk about lines of longitude, because this has been about lines of latitude. Now, let's go and look at lines of longitude, that we can also give another name. Having looked at the lines of latitude, that we also call latitudes, we are now going to look at the other ones that we call lines of longitude. Of course, we can also call these ones simply longitudes. We can also call them simply what? Longitudes. Remember, S is there. So, here now, we are going to adopt the same definition. The other ones we say are imaginary lines. So here we are going to say lines of longitude are imaginary lines. Let's write as whole sentence. Lines of longitude are imaginary lines. Imaginary lines drawn on a map. The difference now here is these ones are drawn from north to south. Imaginary lines drawn on a map from north to south, which means if we are going to have our globe represented in this way still, we are now going to have, instead of having these lines drawn from east to west, we are now going to have these ones from north to south, which means here still we are going to have the major one, which divides this also into 2 equal halves. Of course, still we are having a half. Still we are going to have another half. Now, for this particular one, remember we said each half is given the name hemisphere. Don't forget, even these ones are called hemispheres when they are 2. 1 hemisphere. So for this case, shall we be having again the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere? Automatically the answer is no. Instead of having northern or southern, remember this one is now eastern and the western. So we are going to have this being on the other eastern side of the Greenwich. We are going to have this as the eastern hemisphere. Whereas this one being on the western is now given the name the western hemisphere. Eastern hemisphere, western hemisphere. So this major line dividing this into 2 equal halves is also marked 0 degrees, but it cannot again be called the equator. No, this one is now given the name the Greenwich. Greenwich. Take serious note of the spelling, Greenwich, as one word, Greenwich. Then another name, we also call this line the prime meridian. Prime meridian. Now, we shall also be able to know that this line was also given the name Greenwich because it passes a town in England that is called Greenwich Town. That's why it's given the name Greenwich. So we need to understand that. Now, this one is also the beginning line for measuring other lines of longitude, not again latitude. So we shall find that apart from this one, we also have other lines of longitude drawn. So we shall find that we can have other lines here, like this. We shall have other lines like this. We shall have others like this, like this. So at the end of it all, we are going to find that these lines for them, unlike the other first ones that we talked about, those are the lines of latitude. The other ones were not meeting, they were parallel to each other. Now these ones, we are able to see that these ones meet. They are able to meet at the North Pole, and also here they meet at the South Pole. So that is one difference between lines of longitude and the other lines of latitude. Lines of latitude are parallel to each other. Remember, we also gave them now another name, parallels. Now for these ones, the ones of longitude meet at certain points. So we also need to note that another name we can give to these lines, instead of us calling them lines of longitude, we can also give them another name, meridians. We call them meridians. That's why now we are having this Greenwich meridian, or we call this the prime meridian. So this is another name for the lines of longitude that we need to understand. Then we also have the other line which is important, that is marked 180 degrees. We call it the international date line. International date line. International date line. This is the one that determines the days. Date line. IDL. So that is also another thing that we need to understand. Now, we are going to look at how are these lines important, lines of importance of lines of longitude as our next subheading. Just like we discussed the ones for latitudes, importance of lines of longitude that we can call longitudes. Importance number one, remember on our heading we are saying location of Uganda using lines of latitude and longitude, which means we are going to have our first answer saying that these lines are used to locate places. We can use them to locate places. We use lines of longitude to locate places. Remember, we said in the previous discussion, in the previous heading, that this way of using lines of longitude and latitudes to locate places is what we call the grid reference. So that is what we can have as for that. Then also, we have these lines helping us to tell time. They are used to tell time. And that is when we are looking at the Greenwich line or the Greenwich meridian. They help to tell time. They help to tell time or to determine the time zone. This one we are saying is for that line that we call the Greenwich. The Greenwich, or we can call it the Greenwich meridian. So that is how it helps. Then lastly, we talked about the international date line. The international date line, and we say it helps to determine the date or days. So we can also say these lines are also used to determine the health, to determine days or dates. And we say this is done by the international date line. International date line. That we write in short as IDL. That is what we can add as for the importance of these lines of latitude, longitudes, as for their importance. Now, having understood this, we are now going to understand how can we use these lines of latitude and longitude to locate Uganda, to locate a country. Now, for us to be able to identify this, we need to get the coordinates. Which line or which numbers as in latitudes, and then which numbers are as in longitudes. So, we are going to have the latitudes. So we are going to say that Uganda lies on the latitude 29 degrees where? North. 29 degrees north, and we have 1 degree south of the equator. That is what we are looking at. We have Uganda 29 degrees north of the equator and 1 degree south of the equator, and that is for latitude. Then when we go to the longitudes, we shall have, sorry, this one should have been 4 degrees. This one is the latitude. 4 degrees north. We have the longitudes. And longitudes is the one that we have 29 degrees east. 29 degrees east, and we shall have 35 degrees still east, which means we are going to have, if for example we are having this is east, this is the Greenwich, which means the 29th degree east. For example, maybe if we are having 29 degrees here east, and somewhere here we are having now the 35th degree east, we are locating, we are now finding out where is Uganda. 25 degrees east and 35 degrees still east of the Greenwich. Remember, this side is all in east. When we move this side of the Greenwich, we are moving eastwards. When we are moving to this side, we shall be moving westwards, meaning every degree this way is numbered west. This side, every degree is numbered east. Now, we are also going to have, remember we have our major line of latitude that we call the equator. Now, for this, we shall now have, we are saying, when we follow the latitudes, Uganda is found 4 degrees north, meaning that if this is latitude 1, 2, 3, 4 is here, 4 degrees north, and when we come to the latitude, we have 1 degree south, which means 1 degree south can be here, 1 degree south. So we shall now be able to locate that Uganda is found on the latitude, on the longitude 29 degrees and 35 degrees. And then we are having 4 degrees north and 1 degree south. So it will mean that we shall be having that area there. So that is how we simply locate places using the method that we call the grid reference. For that, we have come to the end of our discussion. We have been discussing pages 18 up to page 22. Thank you for being part of my lesson. I wish you the best.